Hello, beloved viewers. Today's topic is one that took me a while to really ponder over. It's one that I feel is worth bringing up, partially because it's one that has been circling around in my own mind for quite some time now, but it's also a fairly delicate subject, which is why it took me such a long time to get this script together. And I think all you have to do to get an impression of what kind of video this is going to be is read the title. I've been gathering new information, coming across new videos and the like that have made for great cases along the way of writing this, and that's partially why I took some extra time doing this. I've been trying to give as much care and thought into this topic as possible. We hear these philosophies in a variety of places and a variety of sources, encouraging people to love themselves, which is good of course, but it's a really hard thing to internalize for some people. Some factors to this could be related to traumatic events that happened in their lives, their upbringing, either within family or society, a certain toxic relationship they've been in, whether circumstances would play into their favor or not, or what they might be afraid they don't know how to do. You can try to provide them with all the assurance in the world that they don't need to live in the past and they don't need to live their lives in fear and that they truly are someone worthwhile, but it's typically very hard for them to absorb. For some, it's really not easy to take all these beautifully worded bits of advice to heart, no matter how many times you repeat it. But instead of assuming that those people are a lost cause because of it, I recommend just trying a little bit harder to see things from their perspective. I like to be known for being compassionate and raising other people up and brightening people's day, but the truth is that I am very insecure myself. And I'm not making this video to garner pity. It's really to try and help provide a voice to anyone who has trouble articulating why they aren't comfortable opening up to others on some details. Notice I'm going to be speaking namely from my own personal feelings and experiences in hopes that it will touch upon something that maybe you yourself didn't realize. That having been said, since I am largely speaking from my own personal experiences, feel free to leave any comments about any additional details you'd like to add, or anything you feel I should have given more thought into before saying this. The first thing you need to know about people who are their own worst critics, at least the way I see it, is that they've grown used to being prepared for others not to show them the same level of empathy that they themselves try to extend, because the world is just a cruel, hard place to survive in, especially nowadays. I do recognize you have to show the sort of courtesy towards others that you want shown to you, but even if I'm not shown said courtesy, I try not to be quick to assume the worst in people, because most of the problems we face throughout our existence as a species have arisen out of fear and misunderstandings. I don't know what the rest of you go through on a daily basis. You likely have endured a lot more than I'll ever know, and perhaps the rug has been constantly pulled out from underneath you and you don't ever want someone to catch you with your guard down. Maybe you're someone from a different culture who doesn't share the same customs as mine. Maybe you're someone who's not quick to catch on to social cues. That's something that I myself am all too familiar with, being on the autism spectrum. And even if I do my best to be as considerate as humanly possible and show all the interest in the world for someone else's well-being, I still can't demand that anyone trust me. Nor do I blame you if you don't, as you yourself might have a history of being betrayed by people who seem like they could never do you any wrong. And that does bring me to a topic that I will be coming back to later. And I wouldn't expect or try to beg for anyone else's trust, because trust is something that is earned. Respect, on the other hand, is not something I'm quick to agree with the populace that needs to be earned. Please let me explain. I absolutely agree with the mindset that you're not entitled to be respected just by virtue of whatever position you have entailed as authority or whatever, and it's not something you can force anyone to give you. But the mindset that you don't have to respect anyone whom you don't know is one that I am dead set against, at least depending on which context we are regarding respect for. Like the popular mindset that you can trash talk anyone on the internet you have a grudge for just because you're certain that they'll never see your posts. As a person, when I first meet you and don't know you, whether or not I've heard about you or what sort of stuff you've done, you have my respect right out of the gate. And as I get to know you, it will be what you say and do that makes my respect for you rise or fall, even if I have heard some rather unsavory things about you prior to getting to meet you in person. I would never approach you with the intent of trying to attack you or give you some sort of what for. Even if someone I've looked up to for the longest time says that you are absolutely despicable and deserve to lose everything, I would not be quick to take that person's word as the gospel truth. Heck, it's more likely to make me start to question that person's character. Whenever there's news and stories circulating around, I always approach it with a little bit of skepticism. Always keeping in mind that there's most likely a side of the story that I've never before considered. Very much like the classic movie 12 Angry Men, which is an absolute must-watch for everybody, especially if you're living in America right now. But that's why I'm very hard on myself on my slip-ups. Having to pull so many long and difficult hours at my job for years with hardly any sign that I'd be able to make a living for myself as an artist has made me very temperamental on a number of occasions, where I tried my hardest not to snap at people for the slightest inconvenience, and sometimes not being very successful at it. And after those instances, even if I was overall successful, I'm left with questions circling around in my head such as, what could I have done differently? Will I have ended up ruining someone else's day? Could they have been nicer than I perceived them to be in that moment? How will this affect how they perceived me, and to further extent, how much of a future will I have ahead of me? If these questions sound like I'm catastrophizing a scenario, which I may very well be, it's something that arises in part out of a large history of cases where I believe things went over very well, only to discover that they ended horribly in hindsight. Currently, my biggest fear is that I still have yet to reach the ultimate point in my life where I'm left confronting myself in the mirror, where I might say or do something that ends up hurting people I love and change what people think about me. Maybe it could be with just a few people on a small scale, or it could be with thousands of people on a monumental scale. My biggest fear is breaking something that I might never be able to fix. This is an especially prominent fear in days when we're experiencing such things as racial tensions. Another reason why I'm so hard on myself and so desperate to keep myself in check is out of fear that what I do could potentially hurt others, even without realizing it. Because I know that racist doesn't necessarily mean being of malicious intent. It can sometimes mean being ignorant. And hard as it is for me to admit, being of a race, sex, and nationality that has done most oppressing and discriminating throughout history, I have indeed displayed some instances of ignorance and insensitivity in the past, even if the results were not on a dangerously large scale. I realize that one of the hardest, yet most important things to do in order to better yourself and the environment around you is to recognize your own potential to be guilty of more than you know. Nobody likes to think of themselves as the bad guy, and of course, since the world is not so black and white, what we should be focusing more on is trying to listen and be educated of as many perspectives as possible, rather than getting all insecure and defensive about your self-image. But even being aware of all that, it's still really hard for someone like me to deal with a sense of guilt, because it really eats me up inside and manifests itself into shame. People think that guilt and shame are synonymous, but really, they do have a key difference, and that being that one of them lasts very briefly. Shame is where you lose sleep because the thought keeps circling around in your head as to what you could have or should have done differently in that day. Shame is when any time you have to yourself is deprived of peace with questions regarding when everything that has happened to you is something that you brought upon yourself. And shame is constantly calling into question your worth and how deserving or undeserving you are as a human being. We might feel guilty about being envious of the success of others, and we might just as easily, and perhaps even simultaneously, feel guilty about achieving some success that others would envy. We might feel guilty about how we spent our money in the fear that it might bite us hard in the butt sometime down the road. And some people will be quick to declare us as feeling sorry for ourselves, or we're only sorry because we got into trouble for it, while never considering the possibility that we might feel genuinely terrible about potentially hurting people. Even worse is the haunting idea that even if you did learn an important lesson, it would be a lesson that you'd be quick to forget and that you might repeat the same actions, therefore hurting someone else. And you would have forever lost any respect that certain someone might have had for you. So some of us take that extra measure to be especially critical of ourselves to ensure that we do not forget these lessons ever. So keep in mind that if anyone like me just seems too sensitive or too weak or too insecure of themselves, bear in mind that we are most likely far harder on any of ourselves than anyone else ever could be. It's not us trying to be masochistic or anything, it's more often the fear of not knowing the best way to handle every scenario we've been confronted with, and it's made even worse being reminded that our words and actions affect others as well. Even if someone had just a little spat at us just because they were in a bad mood or that particular moment, We can beat ourselves up over it for hours. We can get so hung up over any way we might have inconvenienced someone, whether it would be someone close whom we fear of whether it might create a rift in our relationship with, or someone at work whom our being able to maintain our jobs depends on. And also bear in mind that even if it seems extreme to dwell over these little instances that probably won't matter in the grand scheme of things, it's probably because we've experienced too many instances where we took a situation too lightly and it cost us severely. Again, for this instance, I refer you to 12 Angry Men as one of the many seemingly insignificant details that the men quarrel over to decide the life or death sentence of someone is that one of those 12 men took notice of an indent on the nose of a woman who was an eyewitness, which suggested she wore eyeglasses, but was not wearing them when witnessing what she was describing, so her eyesight was called into question that pervaded the conviction of the guilty verdict. Now, another very apparent reason as to why someone may be too hard on him or herself may be due to upbringing, which I admit does apply to me at least to some extent. Now, I don't want anyone to get the impression that my parents were terrible people at all. They supported me on my journey the whole way, told me to keep pursuing my dreams, never once telling me that they were absurd or that I should pursue something else, and they raised me to be as aware and exposed to as many different viewpoints in the world as possible. They raised me to be a diligent and responsible individual who could live independently, and they sacrificed as much as they possibly could on my behalf to ensure my well-being, and I wouldn't trade them in for any other parents. Still, my parents were typically very blunt with me. They were very no-nonsense when I needed to be taught a lesson. They pulled no punches, never once believing that they were being too hard on me, or at least they would never say that to my face. There did come a point where I was in my college years where I had to stand up to them and get through to them that there were points that what they were doing wasn't helping me, and that they were denying me my own sense of agency. That was the point where my relationship as their son needed to shift for us to still maintain a healthy relationship where we were all happy. It's not that I was being stubborn or ungrateful, I was just being my own person and trying to figure out what my own needs were and what I needed to do to fulfill those needs. And now both my parents respect me and trust me enough to live independently, knowing that I can wisely internalize all the valuable lessons they taught me and use them to my advantage to be a better, more successful person in the long run. But even as someone who has garnered such success, I can be seriously hard on myself when looking back and thinking about how I might not have made it had I not made the decisions I did, all the bullets I dodged because I maintained the self-discipline I did. So some of us who put up with a lot of harsh realities on a daily basis are extra hard on ourselves because we are so determined to keep ourselves in check. But since the journey's not over, imagine what having the constant sensation of trying to keep on your toes and bracing for the next worst-case scenario to occur and desperately trying to stay prepared for it might do to you. And the one thing I can say I'm most afraid of not being prepared to confront might just surprise you, or not given what I just talked about earlier. It's myself. Why is it so hard for someone like myself to internalize claims that are along the lines of, what matters is what you think of yourself, not what others think of you. Why do we push away any praise that others might give us? Are we just being insensitive to others' feelings, or are we just untrusting of them? I think more often it's a case of not being comfortable trusting ourselves. Coming back to what I was saying earlier about being betrayed by people whom you've looked up to, in a world where we constantly hear stories of people turning out to be completely different than how we've perceived them for the longest time, some of whom have been engaging in downright criminal behavior, coupled with how I mentioned we are burdened with the ever-looming awareness that we are prone to being guilty of more than we realize, maybe what we're afraid of is people's good word about us going to our heads, that we might ultimately not be able to recognize when we've changed for the worse, that we worry about potentially getting to a point in life where we are unable to step back and re-examine ourselves, that we feel the need to keep ourselves in check and never let our guard down, lest we end up affirming any and all detractors' claims about us. Well, theoretically, it shouldn't be too hard to bear in mind the idea of not caring what others think until you hear about figures like J.K. Rowling, Butch Hartman, and numerous personas online who have the most idealistic story of achieving the dream after all they've endured, and they built themselves up to a stature where they display that they apparently believe themselves to be above criticism of any kind, or at least don't know how to handle it, and now they're people nobody wants to even be associated with. We're afraid of becoming like that, or at the very least, if we go down that path at one point in our lives, we at least want to be sure we'll be able to turn around from it and redeem ourselves. But now let's talk about the heavy subject of suicide. Once again, this is me going off on my own experience. If someone is feeling suicidal and is totally convinced that the world would go on without them, don't try to reason them with anything along the lines of, they don't want to do it, or they would truly hurt others if they did. You can't make them believe that, probably because a lifetime of traumatic experience might have convinced them otherwise. And I've heard it said by someone else that, if it ever comes to that point, try and ask said person what they believe the will to live is. From a more scientific perspective, the simple answer is that it's what keeps a species from going extinct. If someone is that broken and on the brink of taking their own lives, reasoning with them using words rooted in indisputable objective truth will do much better than trying to guilt them out of it or trying to assure them of something that there is no way they are certain will become true. In fact, it's more likely the case that these people are under the impression that them taking their own lives is the best way for them not bringing others down. Like someone can't seem to find any way to get themselves out of debt, and they might feel guilty about having to rely on others and possibly putting them in debt as well. Or else, it's because anything that they feel brings them such pleasure and a sense of, this is what I'm on this planet to do, they can't experience because it's not seen as productive enough in the eyes of society, and or, again, it's at the expense of the well-being of others. The 2017 movie Loving Vincent does address at one point the theory shared by some historians that Vincent van Gogh might have shot himself out of a haunting sense of shame that he was hurting his brother, who spent a fortune buying him art supplies and producing 800-plus paintings that pretty much never made so much as a cent back while he was alive. He may have gone down in history as having one of the most beautifully artistic minds of anyone who ever lived, but when he was alive, he was largely perceived as a madman whose talent was rarely thought of having any sort of real value. Now, as an artist myself, I still don't make enough money to pay the bills and quit my day job. And not only has it been hard to consistently live with that lacking sense of fulfillment, but my day job has consistently taxed my patience and left me going home feeling tired and in a catatonic state. And I've tried to keep it under control so I wouldn't snap. Which brings me to another factor that could lead to people feeling compelled to take their own lives, and has to me at certain points. There are several moments where I was afraid I was going to snap. So hard that I would go into criminal psychopath mode. Like I'd basically turn into Edward Hyde. And bear in mind, I've refrained from resorting to tobacco, alcohol, and other self-destructive methods of coping. Even if I'm all for getting someone locked up if they're completely unhinged and a threat to the lives of others, I will hesitate to make such claims about a person like, they deserve the absolute worst, they deserve to burn in hell. Because chances are that I might have been in their shoes at one point, and I often get scared thinking about how I could have gone down the same path of darkness had I not been able to get the help that I needed, or should something have happened that pushed me beyond my breaking point. It is for these reasons where I've gone through some very long periods of my life hating or being afraid of myself. It really makes me feel compelled to beat myself up over not being stronger. It's a state that has permeated my life even since I was a kid. But that's also another big reason why I keep in mind that whatever I think about someone is my own perception of them based on all the information I've been given, but I might still be missing a bigger picture, so my thoughts on them are never as set in stone as people. I'd like to refer for a minute to Disney's 1954 live-action adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, during the scenes after Captain Nemo vengefully uses the Nautilus to destroy a cargo ship and its crew which belonged to a fleet that imprisoned him and murdered his family. When the onboard captive Professor Aronnax chastises Nemo for it, he offers sympathy for the captain's suffering, but also says that his hatred is a bitter substitute for love. Then in the following scene, when Aronnax's apprentice declares that he believes Nemo only murders people for personal enjoyment, Aronnax asks him what makes him sure of that. He responds with, "Well, I can only judge him from what I observe." Aronnax scolds him, saying, "He has kept me alive and on board because he believes that he has a use for me. But what's more important is that the world has a use for him and his genius, which I am determined to make him understand. And I assure you that when he does, he will judge himself far more harshly than you ever could." Another piece of media I can think of that exemplifies this is an episode from an underground adult cartoon from the 90s called God, the Devil, and Bob, where Bob, the everyman character, is shocked to learn that his abusive father has died and gone to heaven. When consoling the personification of this show's interpretation of God, he goes on about how he's not getting off of he never knew what was in his dad's heart, because he never shared it with him. God responds, "You're right, and you have every right to hate him and be mad at him. but it's not your job to forgive him, it's mine. In Noah Elkrief's video, You Are Not What You Think, he brings up that sometimes if a bad thought crosses our minds, it's not because we're bad people. It's more likely because we've led lives full of bad things happening to us, and we don't always know how to confront them. If you experience such thoughts and can let them go pretty easily, or if you know how to process your thoughts before deciding to act upon them, you'll have proven that you are a better person than whatever thought or impulse comes into your head. Noah also made this video where he talked about how it's okay not to be productive every waking moment of your life, and how trying to do so is only going to result in running from a fire that is the feeling of unworthiness and security that drives you to success and other stuff. Like if you ask someone what their definition of happiness is, and why they truly want what they seek to obtain, it's so that they don't end up someplace they don't want to end up, and usually that involves some way we're viewed by society. That leads to the final matter I wish to address regarding why people like me are so critical of ourselves. It involves another sense of guilt, shame that we tend to experience. Being completely honest with ourselves when we're not happy. We want something and we go for it, but try as we might, we don't seem to be getting anywhere nearer to it. When people ask if we're happy, we don't automatically say no, because then we'd be called something along the lines of ungrateful little shits. Everyone tells us things like, this is the stuff you have to put up with, or everyone starts at the bottom of the ladder and works their way up. These words are supposedly meant to motivate you and toughen you up, but instead it can result in two other things, depending on the person. Either someone can lose the will to live, or they can undervalue themselves as people and sell themselves short on what they need to get by. This motivates people to push themselves so hard in pursuit of something that they do go to the lengths of eventually neglecting not just their relationships with those closest to them, but also their own health, thinking that once they've reached their goal, they can finally take it easy and catch up on all that stuff. Unfortunately, what more often entails is that they push themselves to the brink, and just when they think that they've made ends meet, they get the rug pulled out from under them, and they end up far worse off than they started. And the worst thing one could ever be quick to assume about a person in this scenario is that they're just feeling sorry for themselves. To the people who say that, did it ever occur to you that we might actually feel extreme shame on both sides of the fence, both for hating our lives and circumstances that many others on the planet would be content with, and also for not being able to be honest with ourselves? And before you try pulling the, oh, you just need to look at it this way card, let me just clear up that that's easily a form of gaslighting, and it can really force someone to undervalue themselves as a person, really believe that hardly anything of value would be lost if they disappeared the next day. People are carving out their own paths and becoming their own people, and they can't do that to their full capacity if they're being suffocated by circumstance and other people taking away their opportunities for happiness. But they will continue to blame themselves for reasons that they can never truly articulate, for any reason other than because society at large said so. But again, I did not make this video for pity reasons, nor is it to make anyone feel bad for not understanding, or to get people to really bend over backwards, not to leave people like me unturned until we're 100% happy and have no reason to be critical of ourselves anymore. I might never be 100% comfortable in my own skin, but that's okay. I'm not sure if that's really possible for anyone living in this world anyway. Also, depending on where you live, the definition of a happy life can vary between individuals and society. I certainly don't believe that just buying more and more is going to bring me happiness, like this consumer culture is trying to get people to believe. But I do want to eventually have the financial security to live in a place that suits my needs, and can rest assured that I'm in a stable position I can be until I ultimately retire. Basically, I want to be able to say that I chose my life, rather than I settled for it. But my goal, as long as I'm alive, is to have accomplished something not just for myself. I don't know why I'm alive, and nor do most people. But as long as I am, I will make something of it. But I don't want to make it all about me, because the world is full of way too many problems that have arisen out of and stepping over the corpses of anyone and anything in pursuit of their own goals. But because I don't believe myself to be anything akin to the most important person who ever lived on this earth, I extend my hand out to others whenever I see the opportunity. Instead of racing ahead to the finish line all by oneself, it's better that we all cross the finish line with multiple people on our sides helping each other along. We are all part of the human race, so let's not make it a me thing about who gets to the finish line first, okay? Because those who did likely skipped an essential step along the way, and it's probably going to bite them in the butt really hard later down the line. And I'm going to try and stay the best person I can be, but after all, I'm still as prone to making mistakes as the next person, and I most likely won't be the same person in 20 years from now. And for that reason, I don't want people to worship me, idolize me, or aim to be exactly like me. What I want instead is to inspire people, provide them with some knowledge, wisdom, and any other useful tools that they can carve their own path with and become their own self. I'm hoping that if something were to happen to me, or if I change as a person sometime in the coming years, even if for the worse, either because of circumstance or because of my own decisions, I'm hoping that what I have taught a few individuals would at least be something that they'd be able to internalize and use to their own advantage later down the line. Those are basically my mom's intentions when she raised me, and I'm passing those down. I'm hoping that some of you watching this right now might do the same. I hope that I gave you something to think about, maybe helping you figure out how to find the sage advice you might need, and giving you a sense of hope of when you really need it. Basically, anything beneficial. And as always, I look forward to hearing from you in the comments and hopefully seeing you in my next video.